Cheers, everybody. Pat Flynn here. Welcome back to Philosophy for the People. We are going to do a morning philosophy study session, and we're going to talk about freedom of the will. Are you a legitimately libertarian free agent? If so, then perhaps you would like to voluntarily pull up a cup of coffee and join me for this study. We are going to read through an essay by Mortimer Adler on freedom of the will. I have been very influenced by Adler in more ways than one. We've talked about him here before on the show. And in fact, we were thinking about doing a series on his book, 10 Philosophical Mistakes, which you should definitely read that. It might be a little too much to try and do a series on that. I'm still thinking about it. But anyways, there's a chapter in that book which would be a great supplement to this study. Anyways, he's got this essay. We're going to read through it. I'm going to read it to you like a baby. And I think this is a really great essay. I think it frames the debate, the libertarian determinist debate really well. It looks at the motivations from both sides. And ultimately, Adler, he really was one of the most studied guys on this subject in recent history. I mean, he has an enormous amount of work out on this. But this essay is a really good, I think, summary of his position. And I think it's directionally correct. I think if you want to think about free will in the right way, this essay, it puts you in the right direction. That's what I'm going to say. And for that reason, I thought it would be a good study for us. And if you want more, you can grab Adler's book on this. Adler himself is actually very much influenced by another influence of mine, which is Yves Simon. Yves Simon has a really great book called Freedom of Choice. I've recommended that before, so I'll recommend it again right now. I also have a short little article over at Catholic Answers called "Physics is Not the Entire Story" or something like that. I don't write the article titles or headlines, but it's about how I think an Aristotelian worldview can really make sense of libertarian agency. So those are some additional resources, but I've actually got another podcast interview I have to do on another show in about an hour. So we have to get right to it. Let me pull up the essay. It's right here. And this is actually, I'm pretty certain this was a lecture. Yeah, it was a lecture that Adler gave in 1961. And I'm just going to read it. And you can follow along, and I'll maybe offer some commentary along the way. And then towards the end, if there is any time left over, maybe we'll do some Q&A as well. So feel free to chime in. If we don't have time, then I'll do a follow-up episode on this and answer some questions there, probably. But I want this. This is 18 pages long, so we might as well get started. So tune in. I'll try to be articulate. I'll do the best that I can in the morning without having had all of my coffee yet. So bear with me and let us begin. So this is from Mortimer Adler, a lecture that he gave in 1961 called Freedom of the Will. All right, so I'm reading now. This is Pat Flynn reading, Mortimer Adler. It has been said by no lesser person than Immanuel Kant that the freedom of the will, along with the existence of God and the immortality of the soul, is one of the great issues the human mind must address itself to and decide where the truth lies. In the vast literature on freedom, this is the only subject which is even partially disputed. It is not, in my judgment, adequately disputed, but it is more fully debated than any other question about freedom. Yet I think you will see, as the evening goes on, that the dispute which I will report to you leaves us in some doubt as to which side has the stronger reasons. Adler is always good at building tension. You know, he's a good storyteller, right? Okay, continuing. He says, I would like to have you play a little game with yourself as I proceed. I shall keep going back and forth, arguments on one side, arguments on the other for a long time. And as I do so, I would like to have you keep your finger on your intellectual pulse. I would be very curious to know, if you haven't already made up your mind firmly before this lecture starts, whether you shift or tend to move from one side to the other, whether in the course of the evening you hear reasons on one side, you think, well, that must be the answer, and then find yourself weakening as you hear reasons on the other. At the very end, I will tell you where I stand. Ooh, see, he knows how to make things exciting. This will be good. You guys, if you want, you can just pretend that I'm Adler, and you can let me know in the comments how you feel as we move along if you want to play the game they originally played. Adler continues, I was and still am very reluctant to give this lecture, not because it is too difficult in the sense of more difficult than other subjects I have treated, but because, unfortunately, this is a subject about which I know too much. There is nothing more deadening to the mind than adequate knowledge of any subject. It prevents that free and easy approach to the problem. It prevents a light-handed gaiety in dealing with opinions. I am weighed down in this case by a 500 pages of manuscript, which was completed last year as part of the volume, The Idea of Freedom, which deals on the subject. Adler is not being immodest there. He really dove so deeply into this subject. And what he says is definitely true. It is often harder to speak on subjects which you know a great deal about because you know all of the nuances, you know all the objections, you know the literature. It's hard to know where to start. It's hard to know what to include. So I resonate with Adler, right? And some of the hardest things to talk about are the things that you've spent the most time with. It's easier to talk about things, I think, when you're kind of ignorant and superficial on them. So just a funny note there. And Adler, he's right. He's studied on this subject. Okay. Continuing, Adler says, in preparation for this lecture, I studied these 5 chapters which were written a year ago. The notes for this evening's lecture covering these 500 pages come to 50 pages. In view of this, you will realize I am giving you an impressionistic and simplified account of the matter with many details left out, with unavoidable inaccuracies that always go with brevity. On the other hand, there may be some advantages to this procedure. For the details involve much repetition. It is really amazing how little original is ever said of any subject. In all of these 500 pages, there are only a few main points repeated over and over again. Right, so that's sort of similar to the disclaimer that I gave. While I think Adler is about to give you a directionally correct and useful summary of this debate, obviously there's many nuances and objections and stuff that he doesn't consider and that can't be considered in 18 pages, right? So just keep that in mind. All right. Adler says this, let me tell you how I am going to proceed. I'm going to start by telling you as precisely as I can what the conception of a free will is on the part of those who affirm that man has one. Then I want you to hear what those who deny it think they are denying. Having set the stage by stating the issue as precisely as I can, I am going to report first the main dispute about the reality of existence of free will. I say this is the main dispute because the arguments here, pro and con, are arguments that go to the heart of the matter, that really affirm or deny the things presupposed, the fundamental facts of nature which are presupposed by anyone who affirms a free will. Then, having done that, I will go to the subsidiary disputes in which the arguments are extrinsic rather than intrinsic. That is, they affirm or deny free will in terms of things that are related to it rather than in terms of what it presupposes. Then it will state 2 very special attacks. One very special attack on determinism, which I think is not answered by anyone, and another attack on free will, which is answered. And finally, at the end, I will try to reveal the crux of the matter. So yeah, Adler's sort of showing you where he falls on this. At the end of the day, he's going to think that there are attacks on determinism that are not only unanswered, but unanswerable, and that the attacks on free will can be answered. So giving you a little teaser. Okay. The freedom of the will is only one among a number of freedoms. The most obvious freedom is the freedom that everybody recognizes as the opposite of being in chains, being coerced, being forced by bodily strength, being in prison. This freedom, which most of us recognize, is entirely in man's possession as a result of fortunate circumstances. Under favorable circumstances, you and I are free to do as we please. We can act as we wish, whatever our purposes or inclinations. If the circumstances in which we are living are favorable, we can execute our intentions, carry them out. This is what most people understand freedom to be: freedom of action under permissive circumstances, which do not impede action or obstruct it. There is another freedom, which is not due to circumstances, and which moralists across the centuries have talked about: the freedom of the virtuous or wise man. It is an acquired freedom, not a circumstantial one, a freedom which men acquire with the acquisition of virtue and wisdom, whereby they can will as they ought. According to this theory of freedom, there is a moral law, a moral imperative, an ideal of life to be approximated. Our wills are not as strong or as good or as true as they might be, and there are obstacles within us, just as there are external obstacles in the world. When one man interferes with another man's action, so within us there are forces, passions, aspects of our lower nature, which sometimes prevent us from acting or willing as we ought. This second kind of freedom, then, is possessed by men of virtue or wisdom who have the strength to will as they ought in conformity with the moral law. Okay, so Adler there is drawing a pretty well-known distinction in the tradition. There's freedom in the sense of freedom from external constraints, external coercion. And then there's the freedom you get that's often sometimes referred to as freedom for excellence, a freedom that you get by having a sort of moral perfection and a sort of moral flourishing. He's just drawing some important distinctions to make sure that we're not confusing the debate and conflating one conception of freedom with the other. But he's going to say neither of these is really what we're talking about when it comes to freedom of the will. He says the freedom of the will is neither of these and quite unlike both of them. It is not dependent upon circumstances. It is not dependent upon the acquisition of virtue or wisdom. If there is a free will, it is possessed by man under any circumstances, and by foolish men as well as wise, by vicious as well as virtuous. For this freedom, if it exists, it is a natural freedom, a freedom inherent in the nature of man. If it exists at all, it is possessed by all men. All men have it, and usually those who affirm such freedom also say that only men have it. The lower animals, the non-rational animals, the brutes, do not have freedom of the will. Freedom of the will is somehow coincident with the possession of reason. Key line. Freedom of the will is somehow coincident with the possession of reason. Keep that in mind. Adler is going to circle back to that. And what does such freedom consist in? If circumstantial freedom is the freedom to act as one wishes, and if acquired freedom that depends upon virtue and wisdom is the freedom to will as one ought, what is this natural freedom? This freedom inherent in the very nature of man as a rational animal. It is the freedom to decide, not to act, not to will in a certain way, but to make up one's own decision. Key point, I'm going to read that again. It is the freedom to decide, not to act, not to will in a certain way, but to make up one's own decision. Perhaps the easiest way to say this is that it is the forming of one's own character creatively by deciding for oneself what one shall do or shall become. Critical paragraph. Reread that if you need. Stated negatively, the point is clearly seen. The freedom to act as one wishes is a freedom from external obstructions and impediments that get in one's way. The freedom to will as one ought is a freedom from inner impediments, one's passions or sensuous inclinations. The freedom of the will is a freedom from one's own past, from one's already formed character, as well as from surrounding circumstances, so that at this moment, no matter what I have been, nor how my character has been formed, no matter what my past is, my inherited nature or my acquired nature, I am still free to choose this or that. Great distinctions. Adler is really helping to clarify this debate. And if you have read much on this debate, especially on the popular level, you'll see these notions of freedom are conflated all the time. So as a good philosopher, Adler is making distinctions. We have to, if we want good answers, we have to ask good questions first, and we have to be clear on what we're actually talking about. So hopefully it's clear to you, gentle listener. All right, let's continue. Now, this is a strange freedom, so strange that I must employ even stranger words, technical terms, in order to keep the repetition of the point brief. In such freedom, these things are involved. One is causal initiative, one is causal indeterminacy, and the third is intrinsic unpredictability. Free will, if it exists, means that the self or the will, and I think that probably the easiest way to talk is in terms of the will, is a cause of one's choices without itself being in effect, without itself being cause. The will is an uncaused cause, a cause which acts without being caused to act. It is not an effect of any prior cause. Another way of saying this is that the will is an active power, able to act without being acted upon by any other efficient cause. For the moment, let this suffice as a definition of causal initiative. So a key thing that you're going to want to get from that paragraph is the will is an active power. The will is an active power. That's going to be critical later on. All right. Causal indeterminacy means that the will as a cause is able to produce one of a number of alternative decisions. Most causes, when they operate, produce one effect. Either a single cause or a set of causes, when it operates, produces its one effect, so that if the same cause operates, you can expect the same effect. The fundamental law of causation, upon which most of the sciences rest, is such that when given a cause or set of causes operates, you can expect from the operation of that cause or set of causes the effect appropriate to it. One effect, one cause, one effect. Same cause, same effect. A given cause operating, only one effect produced. That is what we mean by causal necessity, a necessary connection between cause and effect. So we ordinarily say, if the cause operates, then this effect, and only this effect, must occur as a result. But according to those who hold the doctrine of free will, the will is not that kind of cause. The will is an indeterminate as opposed to a necessary cause, for when it operates, it can produce any one of several effects. That is, the same cause can have one of several effects. Again, very important. The third thing is intrinsic unpredictability. If the will is an uncaused cause and a cause indeterminately able to produce any one of several diverse effects, then it follows from such causal initiative and causal indeterminacy that a man's future choice, if he has free will, are incapable of being foreknown with certitude. Given perfect knowledge of all causes operative in the making of decisions, a man's character, his history, etc., it is impossible to know from this perfect and complete knowledge of the causes which choice he will make. One might know it with some probability, but to know it with certainty is, I repeat, impossible. So Adler's granting, you might be able to give a probability estimate here, but you cannot know with certainty. Now, I am not concerned with whether or not we can ever have perfect or complete knowledge of relevant causes. All that is being said here is that even if such knowledge were available, it would still be impossible to predict with certitude what a man's future choices will be if he makes them with free will. All right, so important to get that right. And that actually plays into ways that you are going to think about God's knowledge and eternal knowledge, and whether there are counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, and whether God really foreknows anything or if he just eternally knows things, and so on and so forth. But I don't want to go down that I don't want to go down that trail yet. Let's just keep with Adler. Adler continues, now I must simplify. In the long history of the subject, not all of the major writers perfectly agree about these 3 points, yet with only 1 or 2 exceptions, glaring exceptions, as a matter of fact, all of the great writers do agree that freedom of the will involves causal indeterminacy and intrinsic unpredictability. All of them coercive free will as an unpredictable act of choice. In the case of causal initiative, a clear majority holds that the will's power to choose freely involves its being an active power, able to act without being acted upon. Hence, a recent author-philosopher in Scotland, C.A. Campbell, says, and I think quite properly, that the freedom of the will should be called a contracausal, because it should be called contracausal because it stands out as an exception to the rule that every cause is itself an effect. It also contradicts the rule that every effect is necessitated by its cause, or that every cause is limited to producing one and only one effect. All right, real quick, I'll just say right here, I think Adler is generally right, but I would add a particular qualification that our will is in fact caused by God, but God is a transcendent cause. So as long as we restrict what Adler is saying to the realm of natural causes, we don't have a problem. But when we take in theological considerations, it becomes more complicated, as you might suggest. But again, we'll set that aside for the present purpose. All right, continuing on, Adler says, and so we see what looks like a clear opposition between the libertarians and the determinists. Let me use those 2 words to name the opposite positions. I will use the word libertarian to name those who affirm the freedom of the will, and the word determinist for those who deny it. The libertarians then affirm, and the determinists deny causal initiative. The determinists insist that the chain of causes is unbroken. There is no cause that is not the effect of some prior cause. There is no cause that is not preceded by other causes which produce it as an effect. Again, the libertarians affirm what the determinists deny, namely the causal indeterminacy of the will. According to the determinists, all causes have the character of necessary causes. Should they fail to have this character, it is a deficiency on their part rather than a kind of causal indeterminacy. All right, so this part most people are familiar with. Libertarians, we're not talking about political libertarianism. We're talking about here in the debate about freedom. Libertarians affirm genuine freedom of the will. Determinists say, yeah, history actually just sort of passes right through you, right? You have no ability to genuinely affect causal history. You can't be a causal initiator. Rather, history just runs right through you, and that's the end of it, and determines all your being, your actions, your beliefs, etc. Okay. Adler, continuing on now, says, and finally, the determinists hold that there is no intrinsic unpredictability in nature. We do not, in fact, have perfect and adequate knowledge of causes, but if we were to have such knowledge, all future effects could be predicted with certitude. Hence, it would appear that we have an issue here. To start, I shall state the main attack on free will. Then I will present the libertarian answer to it. Finally, I will go on to the subsidiary disputes. Okay, so we have the framework. The debate is on the table, And it is time to see how Adler is going to help us think through this and adjudicate it. All right, so the determinists say that the principle of causation is universal and without exception. Human behavior forms no exceptions to the general rule of the reign of causes in the world of nature. This means that every cause is itself an effect of prior causes and is determined by those prior causes. That every effect which happens in nature, in nature is necessitated by its causes. That given the same cause, the same effect must follow, and hence that every effect is intrinsically predictable with certitude. Sorry, that was a messy paragraph, but hopefully you made sense of it. There is a special application to human behavior of this general argument about causes. It is said by the determinists that a man's decisions are determined by his character, both his inherited nature and the way that inherited nature is overlaid and modified by all the accretion of habits that constitute the developed character of man, and by the motives that spring from his character in the particular case. Here we have a man faced with a particularly tough decision to make. He comes to that decision with a whole past, with a formed character, with motives, desires, inclinations that spring from that character in the face of the circumstances. What decision he will make flows right out of his past, through his character, and the present motives aroused by the circumstances that challenge him. In other words, the determinists hold that a man's will is not the uncaused cause of his volitions, rather that his volitions are caused by his present character and motives, and his present character and motives in turn are caused by his previous character and motives that have operated in his actions before. You go back, endlessly back, not merely to his birth, but to his parents, his whole ancestry, and the whole world, in fact. Everything in the whole world that brings this man to this position at this moment, with all the circumstances impinging upon him. Those are the causes that make his decision what it is, and unless the whole world were changed, his decision could not be otherwise than what it is. He could not have chosen otherwise. To expect him to have chosen otherwise is to expect the whole past to be somewhat different, right? So for the determinists, there is some prior factor or set of factors that are prior to, right, and logically sufficient for our decisions, right? And it could not have been otherwise unless those prior factors were otherwise, our decision could not have been otherwise. That's determinism, right? Adler, let's keep going. He says, it is said that a man faced with alternatives always chooses what appears best to him. Does anyone dispute this? But what appears best to a man is determined by the kind of man he is. What appears best to one man is not what appears best to another. Again, the decisive factor is his past, his character, his predilections, his prejudices, his motives. It is said that at any moment, a man's volitions are determined by his predominant desire. At any moment, when we face a difficult choice, we have conflicting tendencies and inclinations. And as we sort of teeter for the moment, before we actually decide, one or another of these desires becomes dominant. What makes that one stronger? Again, under these circumstances, it is a man's past character, his whole biography, that causes one desire to predominate over the others, and that one then determines the decision or choice he makes. Given the same character and the same motives, that the same decision must result. If you even try to say, well, he could have chosen otherwise, you are presupposing that he could have been otherwise. Since he is not otherwise than what he is, since he is this man built up by his whole past, then decision can only be this one. Hence, says the determinist, the very thing that the libertarian is asserting cannot be true. What is the libertarian asserting? It is that at a given moment, with everything in the past the same, all antecedent conditions the same, with this man's character exactly as it is, with the circumstances what they are, and his motives the same, he could have chosen otherwise than he did. The determinist says, no, this is impossible. Only one choice is possible for him. He could not have chosen otherwise. Right. Okay. I need a second sip of coffee. I'm choosing to have a second sip of coffee, even though I strongly desire it. I could choose not to. See that? Just took my cup of coffee away just like that. But now I'm deciding to bring it back. Okay. All right. Adler says, I have presented two of the determinist arguments, and now I want to present a third, a very special one. In the long history of the subject, in days when theology was queen of the sciences, in the 6th or 7th centuries, which saw the development of Jewish, Islamic, and Christian theology, there was a strong argument against free will on the part of those who believed in God. It is said of God alone that he is the first cause. God alone is the uncaused cause. It is believed that God is omnipotent and omniscient, that God's will is always done, that everything is subject to God's will, and that nothing is uncaused by God. There is no happening which is not subject to the divine causal power, and nothing which is not within the purview of divine knowledge. Now, if God alone is an uncaused cause, the will cannot be an uncaused cause. And God, being omnipotent and omniscient, foreknows and foreordains and foreknows everything that happens. Hence, man's future decisions must be necessitated and must be intrinsically predictable for God, if not for us. To say that God is omniscient makes it impossible to say that anything is unforeseeable by God. Yet the libertarian seems to be saying that man's future free choices are unforeseeable by anyone, including God, with perfect and absolute knowledge. This is precisely what many theologians who affirm an omniscient and omnipotent deity have denied. So this is an important remark by Adler because it shows that the libertarian determinist debate doesn't map on perfectly with, say, theism and atheism, right? There are theists who are theological determinists, for example. So it's as many things are more complicated than one might initially expect. And there were people who denied freedom of the will from theological and theistic considerations, not just, say, an atheistic mechanistic worldview. And I'm glad that Adler's pointing that out because that's sometimes overlooked. Okay. Now, Adler says, how does the libertarian answer all these arguments? It might seem that the libertarians would counter these attacks by denying the principle of causation. If there is an instance of an uncaused cause, and then say there is, then this invalidates the principle of causation. But in fact, that is not their argument. No libertarian, no defender or exponent of the doctrine of free will has ever denied the universal principle of causation or has ever denied its universality. Not only do they say that the principle of causation is true, but that it is universally true without exception. And what they understand themselves to be saying when they say this is that in the whole world of nature, there is nowhere to be found an effect without a cause. An uncaused effect, they are saying, and here they are agreeing with the determinists, is a contradiction in terms. But they qualify the principle of causation in a manner which leads them and the determinists to part company. For in their view, to say there is no effect without a cause is not to say that there is no cause, which is not itself an effect. Let me repeat that. For in their view, to say that there is no effect without a cause is not to say that there is no cause, which is not itself an effect. Hence, the universal principle of causation can be affirmed without denying that the will is a cause producing effects through its acts are not effects produced by prior causes. Again, let me read that sentence again. Hence, the universal principle of causation can be affirmed without denying that the will is a cause producing effects through its acts are not effects produced by prior causes. Okay, somewhat of a clunky sentence, but hopefully the point came across. The will, they say, is an exceptional kind of cause. In the whole nature, the will is the only active power. What is meant by an active power becomes clear if we contrast it with powers like our senses. When you have sensations, these sensations produce effects. You react in many ways to your sensory impressions, but your senses do not act unless they are acted upon. Sensations, as you experience them, are the effects of other causes, the various impulses of light or sound or pressure that reach your sense organs. Hence, the senses are passive powers. They act only when they are acted upon. What is being said about the will is that the will acts without being acted upon. It is an agent, a primary agent. Yet the libertarian says that this does not violate the principle of causation because the acts of the will are caused by the will itself. The will is the cause of its own acts. And so the acts which take place are effects that have a cause though that cause, the will, is not itself a caused cause. Let me read that sentence one more time. The will is the cause of its own acts. And so the acts which take place are effects that have a cause, though the cause, the will, is not itself a caused cause. The libertarian then goes on to say that even though all the physical causes necessitate their effects, the will is not a physical cause. It operates differently from other physical causes. All of our attention must be focused on the following point. The determinists hold the view that in nature there is only one type of causation. It is a type of causation which is evidently manifest in the physical world. Perhaps the easiest way of making the point for you is to say that it is a kind of causation which is most manifest in simple classical mechanics, the kind of cause and effect relation which becomes evident to one in the study of elementary mechanics or that one sees in the operation of machines. Though I do not mean that all of the natural science is as simple as that, nevertheless, that is a type that is a type of the physical cause. The determinist is a fellow who is saying that all causes are of this type, whereas the libertarian is saying that many causes, in fact, most causes, but not all are of this type. There is, in addition, an immaterial cause, the will. The mind, including reason and will, is not matter, is not a body, not an organ in the sense in which the eye is an organ. And therefore, when it operates as a cause, it operates differently as a cause. This is critical. This is going to be very critical. There's lots of critical. I keep saying everything's critical. Well, it's all critical, but it's kind of the nature of Adler doing a lecture of this. He's trying to summarize a critical point. So it's not surprising that there's a lot of critical points in a summary of a otherwise very extensive debate. Okay, let us continue. Now, let me see if I can indicate what the difference is. In the physical world, given a particular cause or set of causes, that cause has the power to produce only one effect. In the case of the will, according to those who think of it this way, it is a superabundant cause, a cause with so much power that it can produce any one of a number of effects. Its power extends to whatever is possible. The relation between cause and effect here is one to many, where in the physical world it is one to one. Adler, using the idea of the will being a superabundant cause, he's taking that right from the Yves Simon. It's a brilliant and I think absolutely correct idea. So I just want to underline that phrase. Let us return to the idea that a man faced with several alternatives chooses what is best for him. The libertarian argument stresses the importance of the word chooses. The point is that an actual choice is involved. We have seen how the determinists account for the man's decision. Now let us take the same man facing the same problem and see how the libertarians have him decide. Pay close attention, dense listeners. It's about to get real good. In the difficult choice, there are different motives competing. There are reasons for acting one way and reasons for acting another way. The libertarian maintains that these reasons in themselves are not determinative of the action. Let me say that again. The libertarian maintains that these reasons in themselves are not determinative of the action. No one reason is strong enough to make the man decide. First, the man must decide, and it is his decision to act on one reason rather than another, which makes that reason stronger than others. Critical sentence. Let me read it again. First, the man must decide, and it is his decision to act on one reason rather than another, which makes that reason stronger than the others. If it were otherwise, the libertarian proposes, if any one reason of itself were strong enough to determine the action, the man would have no difficulty in making the decision. He would merely act as the reason dictated. It is the very difficulty that attests the existence of free will. Faced with a series of alternatives, we ourselves, by the act of choice, endow one alternative with greater attractiveness. None of them by itself is sufficiently attractive. None of them by itself is sufficiently attractive to move us. It is only by choosing that we make this one and make it attractive enough that it is only by choosing that we take this one, this reason, and make it attractive enough to act upon. And in that fact lies the freedom of our choice. Since that is difficult to understand, I am going to expand it a little further. Even if there is no free will, as there may not be, even if there is no free will, as there may not be, the libertarian is saying that if you are introspective about your own experiences, this does not have some similitude to what you feel. To understand this, you must remember some difficult decisions you have made, not easy ones. Time when you went for several days or several weeks or several months before you can make up your mind about whether to do this or that. What happened? Suppose it is a choice between A and B. You put the reasons down in one column for A and the reasons down in one column for B. Now, if the reasons you put down in one column had demonstrative force, if they proved, as a proof in geometry does, that decision A was the right decision and disproved decision B, you would have no problem. You would have proof. And if you're a rational person, your decision would follow. It would be completely determined by the probative reasons. But, says the libertarian, the reasons are never like that. No matter how many you put down, they will always be inconclusive. So, when you come to the end of your deliberation, you will have two opposed practical judgments, each supported by reasons. Now, your action will follow from whichever one is the last judgment you hold on to. But what makes that judgment the last one? What makes you terminate the process of deliberation by taking this judgment, the judgment A as opposed to B? The reason did not do this for you. It is your will that did it. You voluntarily chose judgment A. In that fact lies your freedom of the will. Brilliant. What he's saying is your freedom of the will is just the power to end deliberation, right? It is the power to make any finite motive ultimately efficacious. Why? Because we can always consider finite motives from different perspectives. None of them are determining in and of itself. We might be determined by the good itself, right? Ultimately, God. But any finite particular good is not strong enough to determine us because we can always conceptualize over it differently. Thus, the will is just the power to end deliberation, and it is an active power. That's what Adler is saying. I think that's fundamentally correct. Let us continue. Another way in which the libertarian answers the determinist is to say that certainly a man's character has influence on his decision, but the simple fact is, and everyone knows this to be a fact, that a man can either act in accord with his character or against it. If we could never act except in accordance with our character, we could never change our character. But there is perfectly clear evidence that men do change their characters. This means that it must be possible for men to act against their characters. Moreover, the character itself, says the libertarian, is formed by free choices. Hence, since it is formed by free choices, it cannot determine the choices themselves in a way that makes them unfree. This is not to deny that we can, with fair or even high probability, predict a man's decisions. So Adler's saying, look, we can, with a fair amount of probability, make predictions, but we cannot ultimately, with absolute certitude, know what they're going to be. And finally, with regard to the intrinsic unpredictability of human decisions, the libertarian position is that science will never succeed in the sphere of human behavior as it has in the sphere of human phenomena, right? And look, Adler made a successful prediction. He wrote this in 1961, and that's right. Right? Science has not succeeded in this sphere. That's exactly what we would expect if Adler's points are correct here. With respect to the theological argument, those libertarians who affirm an omnipotent and omniscient God take one of two positions. Some say that God is omnipotent and omniscient and that man's will is free, but how to reconcile these things they do not know. They just acknowledge there's a great mystery here. Other theologians hold that there is no incompatibility between God's omnipotence and omniscience and God's free will. They have argued this in two ways. So I'm of the latter camp, just personally. One argument is as follows. God does not foreknow anything. Foreknowing puts God in time as if there was some future to him. But God, being eternal, is outside of time in an eternal present. All things, past, present, and future, are simultaneously present to the divine vision. He knows them as actual, not as future and about to happen. There is no conflict between what God actually knows and the unpredictability of future choices from the point of view of man's knowledge of the future. This is absolutely right. This is the traditional eternity solution that was, you find this as far back as Boethius. This is in Consolation of Philosophy. God knows things as actual, as present before him in all eternity. How common it is to see people still making these objections from God's foreknowledge against human freedom. It just shows a great theological ignorance, especially of classical theism, which Adler summarizes just beautifully here. God does not foreknow anything because foreknowledge puts God in time. Now, if you're a theistic personalist who thinks that God is in time, okay, now you have to contend with this. But if you're a classical theist and hold that God is eternal, that diffuses a ton of the sort of initial or apparent tension in this position. Of course, you have to go a bit further eventually, as I have done in other episodes, because it's not just God's knowledge that might seem to be in tension, but God's knowledge as executive, as causal. And that's where the work of Matthews Grant and the stuff I've talked about in that department, I think, could be helpful. But again, for another conversation at another time. Let's continue with Adler. Adler says the second argument is as follows. It boldly maintains that a man's future free choices are essentially unknowable with certitude, even to God. That's correct. God is omniscient, but it is no limitation on God's omniscience not to know what is unknowable. Omniscience means knowing everything that it is possible to know. Not to know what is impossible to know is not to be limited in knowledge. So this, again, I've mentioned this before. This is my problem with Molinism. Molinism posits God having middle knowledge, where he has knowledge of counterfactuals or creaturely freedom. I maintain, along with Adler, that is just a complete theological invention. There's nothing to know about a free decision until that free decision is brought about concurrently with God's activity. So God knows our free activities by concurrently bringing them about when they are brought about, and God knows them presently from all eternity. Once you have that model, all these issues go away. You can affirm God's eternal perfect knowledge, omniscience, genuine human freedom, God's universal transcendent causality as concurrent with human active power of the will. All the pieces can fit together if you're willing to think about this matter deeply and not like a kindergartner. Okay. Adler continues, the crux of the matter so far is this. On the one hand, we have a materialistic and mechanistic theory of causation, or to put that even more neutrally, a theory of causation in which there is only one kind of cause operating one way, and an opposite theory of causation, which tries to say that there are material and mechanical causes, sure, and causes that operate in the world of mind or spirit, operating in a different fashion. Right. And this is definitely the traditional and indeed Thomistic view, I would argue. There are sure physical causes, but there are also immaterial causes, immaterial operations as well. Now let us turn to a subsidiary dispute, which is as interesting, though not as fundamental. I'm going to start with the libertarian position. He says what most of us would say. I affirm free will or free choice because the freedom of man's choice is presupposed by the whole world of morality. Should I deny freedom of choice, I would make nonsense of all my moral judgments. We praise and blame human beings for what they do. In accordance, we reward and punish them. But to reward and punish men or praise and blame them is tantamount to holding them responsible for their acts. But men cannot be held responsible for acts they did not freely choose to perform. Hence, if anyone denies free choice, he is completely removing the basis for moral responsibility. And when you remove the basis for moral responsibility, you make nonsense of praise and blame, reward and punishment. Since mankind is not going to give up praise and blame and reward and punishment, since it insists upon holding men more morally responsible for their acts, it is better to affirm which is presupposed. For not to do so would be self-contradictory. It would be to insist upon a conclusion without a premise. Therefore, the libertarian says we must either give up the whole fabric of our moral and social life, or we must assert ourselves to have free choice. So as Adler says, this is a subsidiary issue that doesn't prove free will, but it starts to show the consequences of what happens if you begin to deny it. The second argument that libertarian advances is that we are directly or immediately conscious of making free choices. Every moment of the day, I seem to be conscious of the fact that I am choosing to do this or that. I do not feel myself internally forced. I do not feel my past operating on me. When I am forced with an option, particularly when it's a difficult one, I struggle. I struggle with my will to decide this way or that. I am conscious, says the libertarian, that I am forming my own volitions. Such evidence either directly supports the existence of free will or at least gives rise to the belief that we have it. That belief then raises a serious problem for the determinists to deal with. So Adler is appealing to deep intuition and introspection here, and that is perfectly legitimate. I think that is a profound argument that is often overlooked and something determinists really fail to deal with. We have to rely on deep intuitions and seemings and introspection on some level. If you deny this stuff altogether, then you can't even know anything, including anything that you think you know from science and causality, right? So if you try to turn out the lights on introspection and intuition altogether, you're gonna ruin rationality. You're gonna ruin all the basis for any knowing, all epistemology, all science, right? So we have to give some, I would actually say, a considerable amount of weight to deep intuition, the power of introspection. And now they're saying, like, look, this is a deep intuition. And just through basic introspection, we know, like, look, I'm raising my hand. I'm choosing to do it. I'm willing all these things all the time. It's basic. It's immediate. I have a direct acquaintance with myself as a libertarian free agent. That is not to be overlooked or underplayed. All right. He continues, the determinist enters the debate in the following manner. With respect to the interrelation of free choice and responsibility, there are two kinds of determinists. William James pointed out that there are soft determinists and hard determinists. Let me first tell you what the soft determinists say. Okay, so we're going to get some more distinctions here. And boy, are you guys having fun? I hope you're having fun with this. This is quite a thing to read aloud for a Saturday morning. But I wanted to get this here as an asset for everybody. So that way, whenever other questions or debates about free will come up, I can at least point people here as a starting point. All right, let me have another cup of coffee and we'll continue. This not a cup, another sip. The soft determinists say that the dilemma about free choice and responsibility can be avoided. They say that the only thing required in order to hold a man responsible is that he not be coerced. If what he does is an expression of what he wishes to do, then even if he does not determine what he wishes to do, even if his wishes, his decisions, and choices are internally determined by his past, you can hold him responsible when he acts voluntarily. You cannot hold a man responsible for failing to act if he is chained. You cannot hold a man responsible for acting if he is pushed by sheer force. But if what a man does comes from him because it is a voluntary action, not a compelled one, not a forced one, then whether or not that action flows from free choice is of no importance so far as responsibility is concerned. Okay, so sometimes soft determinism often gets labeled under the blanket of compatibilism as well in the contemporary debates, just to help out with some terminology. Adler continues, they go on to say, moreover, that when you punish him, you can alter what he was doing in the future, just as you punish an animal and change his behavior. The rewards and punishments you give animals change their future conduct. That is the purpose of punishment and reward, changing future conduct. You praise and blame people really to affect their future conduct. If you can affect their future conduct by praise and blame and reward and punishment, that is quite sufficient for responsibility. Responsibility, which is equivalent to alterability by punishment or alterability by praise and blame, is based simply on voluntary conduct. So that's how Adler's saying the soft determinists enter this debate and try to respond to the issue of moral responsibility. And not just moral responsibility, I would say, but moral culpability. Moral culpability. Okay, so what the soft determinist is saying is that if a man is able to act as he wishes, the actions he performs can be imputed to him. They are his acts, not somebody else's. If they are his acts, he is responsible for them. If he is responsible for them, you should praise and blame him, reward and punish. And such rewards or punishments, praise or blame, will affect his future conduct. Praise and blame and reward and punishment should have only a prospective significance. They should look only to the future. They have no relation to the past. You cannot affect the past. You cannot change the past. You cannot do anything about the past at all. Hence, you should punish and reward therapeutically, remedially, prospectively, with an eye to getting different results in the future. That's a soft determinist position. Okay. Now, the hard determinist recognizes that moral responsibility presupposes the existence of free will. Mere voluntariness will not do. If the voluntary act does not itself flow from a free choice of the will or a free choice made by the self, then the individual is just not responsible for his act. The reason why the hard determinist says this is that he thinks punishment must be retributive as well as prospective. You can praise and blame men for what they have done, even if they are dead now, and you cannot change them. And if you can do that, rewards and punishments must be retrospective as well as prospective. But they cannot be retrospective, says the hard determinist, unless there is legitimate free choice, not just voluntariness. The hard determinists thus agree that the libertarian is right if he says free will is required for responsibility. But being hard determinists, they also say that free will does not exist, and therefore there could be no moral responsibility. One man's modus ponens is another man's modus tollens, as they say. There is no basis for rewards and punishments, praise and blame. You see why this position is called hard determinists, right? So yeah, this is just the biting of the bullet. The determinists agree. They'll say, look, yes, libertarians, you're right. If everything is determined, there can be no moral responsibility and culpability. So rewards and punishments, praise and blame don't make sense. But look, I'm committed to determinism. So I'm just going to say that, yeah, there is just nobody can really be held morally responsible. They're just sort of biting the bullet. But they're being more consistent, at least from a libertarian perspective, even if they can't ultimately live consistently with that position. Right? The libertarian, faced with these two opponents, agrees with the hard determinist on the analysis of freedom and responsibility, and disagrees with him only on the existence of freedom in question. He, too, says that praise and blame must be retrospective and that punishment must be retributive as well as remedial. When you praise or blame dead men, you are not affecting the future conduct. Capital punishment does not have as its end the changing of man's future conduct. Such a view of praise and blame and reward and punishment involves a view of responsibility that must be rooted, says the libertarian, in free choice. In addition, the libertarian points to the criminal law, distinguishing between degrees of homicide. We say a murder performed in cold blood with malice and forethought is a different kind of homicide from one done under provocation or blind rage. The reason for this, says the libertarian, is that there are degrees of freedom here. In one case, the man's choice is completely free. In the other case, his choice is not as free. There are cases where the man acts in a frenzy, where he lacks freedom entirely, and then we say he is not responsible at all. Our whole body of criminal law must be without foundation if our differentiation of the degrees of responsibility based upon degrees of freedom were not true. With regard to the evidence of consciousness, the determinist simply dismisses it as illusory. Our feeling of freedom is only an illusion. The libertarian replies that the only grounds for thinking it is an illusion is a prior obstinate belief in determinism. He accuses the determinists of denying that which he feels to be true on the basis of a prior prejudice. I mean, how true that is, and how true that is even today. Even today, the debate, I mean, friends, notice the debate has not changed much in either the popular or professional level. It's pretty much the same debate here. You still have your hard determinists, you have your compatibilists, and you have your eliminativists, right, that want to, not just deny our introspective, intuitive awareness of conscious of agency, of libertarian agency, but consciousness altogether as well. Libertarians, excuse me, are saying this is just driven by an entirely ridiculous prior prejudice, and what the reasonable person should do is give up that prejudice and consider a fresh paradigm here. All right, I am now going to deal with two very special attacks on determinism and one very special argument against free will. Then I will sum up. I can say without exaggeration that these special attacks have never been answered. Up to this point, there has been a kind of balance. One side argues one way, the other side meets that argument. Two special attacks on determinism I am now going to state are curiously enough answered by no determinists. I have never found in the literature any response to these criticisms or objections. So Adler says at the end of the day, he thinks there are decisive, unanswerable objections to determinism, but libertarianism can handle objections against it, and so Adler is a proponent of libertarianism. So let's see what he's got. The first of these two special arguments is as follows. If the judgments of the mind are all necessitated, as the choices of my will are supposed to be necessitated, scientific method is meaningless. What does a scientist or a philosopher who is trying to think objectively do? He is trying to look at the weight of the reasons and the weight of the evidence and decide which is the right solution of the problem. But if, as he approaches the problem, the decision he is going to make is determined by his past, why bother with scientific method? Why bother with the canons of logic? Why bother with any principles of reason at all? As it happens, the laws of physics are not the laws of logic. Let us, for example, apply this. Let us, for example, apply this to this very issue, the issue before you between libertarianism and determinism. Suppose I say to you, how many of you are determinists? And you raise your hand. And then I say, how many of you are libertarians? And you raised your hand. If the reasons why you responded as you did was your past, then what is the argument all about? Why did I even bother to give the lecture or present the arguments? There is no real issue here. There is nothing worth debating if our intellectual decisions are determined. William James, who was much agitated about this problem, told a wonderful story bearing upon this particular point. He said a man was walking down a narrow street one day. As he walked down, he saw in a second-floor window on one side of the street a sign which said Determinist Club. On the other side, he saw a sign which said Free Willist Club. He went into the Determinist Club first and said he would like to join. The girl behind the desk said, "Why did you come in here?" He said, "I freely chose to." And of course, they threw him out. So he went across the street into the Free Willist Club and they said, "Why did you come in here?" He said, "I had no choice." And they threw him out. The other thing the libertarian says is that the question about free will is a very difficult one, an issue where neither side can prove its case conclusively. Both sides must appeal to certain basic assumptions that never will be proved in the full sense of proof. The assumptions about causes which the determinist makes are important for science in respect to the whole physical world, if not the sphere of human behavior. And the libertarian's assumptions about free choice is important to the whole human world in the sphere of morals and politics. Faced with the conflict of assumptions, you are free to adopt both of them, each in its own sphere. When you say, I adopt the determinist assumption for the whole physical world, and I adopt the libertarian assumption for the moral world of human behavior, you do that freely. The libertarian says that is consistent with being a libertarian, but not consistent with being a determinist. Since this is the only rational solution of the matter, the libertarian says that he has the better position, right? So Adler's focusing on morality, but I go further. I would say that all of rationality goes down without the ability. If the space of reasons is not greater than the space of causes, then we have lost reasoning itself. That's how I would summarize it. But the space of reasons is greater than the space of causes. And the will is an act of power. And that's exactly why we have the ability to reason. All right. Adler says, I turn finally to one more argument against free will, and it is a strong one. It begins with Hume, who said that all causes are effects of prior causes and that all causes necessitate their effects. What is not caused in this way is nothing but pure chance. If a man's decisions or choices are not caused in this way, then they are purely matters of chance. But how can you hold a man responsible for matters of chance? In fact, this is one thing we do not hold a man responsible for. We could hold him responsible for what he does intentionally or negligently. But if something happens by chance, we do not hold him responsible. Hence, if free will did exist, it would preclude moral responsibility. Since free will involves the element of chance, it would make moral responsibility impossible, and we would have no basis for praise and blame, rewards and punishments. Okay, so this is your classic, if it's not determined, it's random objection against libertarian freedom, which is an objection that I responded to in my article for Catholic Answers, claiming that it is trying to force a false choice upon us. But let's see how Adler responds to this. Oh, first he's going to re-articulate it. He says, another form of this argument is as follows. Only that which flows from a man's established character can be imputed to him as his choices or actions. You look at that man and say those acts are properly his, they flow from his character. But if a man has free will, according to libertarian theory, then Hume contends his choices do not flow determinately from his character. Given that same character, the individual can make diametrically opposite choices. If given the same character, the individual can make diametrically opposite choices, then those choices cannot be imputed to the individual, for they are no better than chance. But again, how can you hold a man responsible by what happens by chance, right? So if not determined, then random, and neither of those actually are what we mean by free will. That's the objection, right? The libertarian replies to this argument as follows. The will or the self is the cause of man's decisions, not his character, even though his character may influence the decisions he makes. Since his decisions flow from his will or his self, even though not from his character, they can be imputed to him and can be held responsible for them. It is only on the determinist theory of causation that the absence of necessity becomes identical with chance. That's critical. It is only on the determinist theory of causation that the absence of necessity becomes identical with chance. If not determined, random, those are not contradictories unless you are a determinist. They're just contraries, right? That's sort of what Adler's pointing out. Because on the libertarian theory of causation, a free choice is caused even if it's not as necessitated. There's a third category here. There's another category, right? That is neither determined nor chance, but reasons-based action. That's the scholastics would call it, reasons-based action, right? That the determinist is missing in their sort of worldview toolkit here. There is no element of chance at all in a freely based choice. Say it again. There's no element of chance at all in a freely caused choice. Hence, free choice does not preclude moral responsibility. Let me go once again to the crux of the matter. Both sides agree that chance, the total absence of causation, does not exist in the universe. Both sides agree that if man's decisions were chancy, he could not be held responsible for them. They agree on this. The question, therefore, boils down to this. Does free will reduce to chance? Does free will evolve chance in any way? If so, the determinists are right. However, if the libertarians shared the determinist understanding of causation, he would have to agree with the determinist rejection of free will as non-existent and precluding responsibility. However, according to the libertarian theory of causation, free choice does not involve even the slightest trace of chance. If the determinist shared the libertarian's understanding of causation, he would similarly have to agree with the libertarian's affirmation of free will, for he'd have no grounds for denying its existence and would see that it does not preclude responsibility. The crux of the matter, therefore, lies in two theories of causation, right? So the disagreement I was saying is actually more fundamental. It's a disagreement about the very nature of causation itself. The determinist basic point is that all causes are of the same type, the type that we find in the physical world or in mechanical action of bodies. In this type of causation, there is no uncaused cause and no non-necessitated cause. Hence, the causal initiative and causal indeterminacy required for free will is tantamount to causelessness or chance. The libertarian's theory, on the other hand, is that there are different modes of causation. One that applies in the physical world, the realm of matter, and one that applies in the spiritual world, the realm of mind, reason, will. In the sphere of mind, the will is an active power. The will as an active power can cause without being caused and can cause any one of a number of alternative effects, though all the circumstances in its whole past and character remain the same. And it can do this precisely because it is a spiritual power which operates causally in a different way from the way in which bodies operate in physical events of cause. Most of you, I am sure, stand on one side or the other in this argument. It is hardly a subject about which you can be neutral. I will ask you all to pronounce which side you affirm. The answer you give yourself comes from the view you take on the nature of things. If you take the view that there is nothing in the world except bodies, material forces, and material actions, I am sure you give the determinist answer. But if you say no, there is room in this world for the immaterial, for a spiritual power, then you will probably give the libertarian answer. Further, your answer is affected by which view of responsibility you take, whether you think you can praise or blame dead men, whether you think rewards and punishments are retributive, or whether you think that punishing of men is no different than punishing of animals. On the determinist view, you punish animals only to change their future conduct. If you feel that animals are not morally responsible and punish them with an intent different from that which applies when you punish men, then you will be on the free will side. If you think that we should treat men and animals in exactly the same way and reward and punish them for the same reasons, then you are on the determinist side. Where do I myself stand? I will tell you very quickly. Having lived through this, not just tonight, but for many years, I hold the libertarian view as against the determinist view because I think there is strong, almost conclusive, but not quite conclusive, evidence for the immateriality of the human mind. Evidence that it is not a physical organ, that is not like an eye or an arm or a muscle, not something that has mass or the dimensions which matter has. In addition to affirming the immateriality of the human mind, I think that the libertarian has a much sounder and more comprehensive theory of causes. Further, I agree with the hard determinists against the soft determinists that moral responsibility, praise and blame, rewards and punishment cannot be rationally founded except on the basis of man's having free choice. I hold this view because I think that praise and blame can be significantly retrospective and punishment can and must be in part retributive. Finally, I think there is no answer to the two special arguments against determinism. One, you will recall, is that determinism makes nonsense of the whole intellectual life, of scientific inquiry, of rational debate, of argued differences of opinion, the reality of all issues. If the determinist is not determined by his past and his character to be a determinist, then he is only one by free choice on his part, just as I am a libertarian by free choice. But if the position one takes on the issue is a matter of free choice, then clearly it is sound to take the libertarian position. Whoo! We did it, my friends. We got through Adler's Freedom of the Will. I hope you enjoyed that. That was sweet. I liked reading that. I think that's a great issue. I would offer more commentary and do Q&A, but in just a couple of minutes, I have to go on somebody else's podcast and do an interview. So leave whatever comments and questions you have and below, and maybe I'll try and do a follow-up episode here. Well, I don't know. I'll offer my follow-up thoughts and take whatever questions you have. In the meantime, you can check out the article I wrote for Catholic Answers, which I think goes a little bit deeper into the Aristotelian metaphysics of substance first view, right? That gives us I think the background metaphysical framework to really make robust sense of libertarian freedom. So that'd be a nice supplement. Also going to recommend Yves Simone's book, Freedom of Choice. Adler is heavily influenced by him. Adler's got the much larger volumes on freedom of the will, but also in his book, 10 Philosophical Mistakes, one of the latter chapters goes a bit deeper into it as well. So if you like this, you'll probably like all that stuff. Please check it out. Please do like, comment, share, and subscribe. Really helps the video. So if you comment afterwards and just whatever, just that sort of thing is helpful, and I would appreciate it. So hope you enjoyed that. By the way, if you like this sort of like a little bit deeper dives, if you like the reading of things and the commentary, check out some of our Pay What You Want courses. I've got a Pay What You Want course and study on cosmological reasoning, the principle of sufficient reason. All that is over at my Gumroad account. I'll link that later, and you guys can check that out if you want to support the channel in another way as well. I got to go do another podcast, and I have to use the bathroom. So see ya. Bye-bye.